Welcome to our deep dive today into the world of Islam.
Okay.
We're tackling a pretty multifaceted topic, the intersection of Islam, politics, and peace. We've got a fascinating mix of sources to draw from,
Okay.
scholarly articles, historical analyses, and even a peace education case study.
Sounds good.
You're basically getting a crash course in Islamic thought. We'll be debunking some common misconceptions and exploring how different Islamic thinkers have approached this quest for peace.
All right.
Sounds pretty intriguing, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's a topic that is often oversimplified in mainstream media. So taking a deep dive like this is crucial for understanding all the nuances and complexities.
Okay, let's start with a term we hear a lot these days, political Islam.
Right.
It feels like it's constantly in the headlines,
Yeah.
but what does it actually mean in practice?
So political Islam, sometimes called Islamism,
Okay.
is essentially the idea of using Islamic principles
Oh, wait.
as the foundation for a political order. It's been a dominant force in the Middle East
No.
for over 4 decades, encompassing everything from Wahhabism in Saudi Arabia to the activism of the Muslim Brotherhood, and even the rise of radical groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS.
Wow, that's a pretty wide spectrum. You mentioned Wahhabism in Saudi Arabia, which always seems like such a rigid interpretation of Islam. But one of the articles you sent mentioned that Saudi Arabia is shifting away from Wahhabism
Okay.
as a national identity. They even instituted a founding day that celebrates the nation's origins before the alliance with Wahhabism.
Oh, interesting.
And apparently the visuals for this new national identity don't even include religious symbolism.
Okay.
That seems like a pretty significant departure, wouldn't you say?
It is. Yeah, it is significant. It suggests a potential move towards a more nationalistic identity, possibly prioritizing economic and social goals over strict religious adherence. It's too early to say what the long-term implications will be, but it's definitely a trend worth watching.
What about the Muslim Brotherhood? They've been a major player in the region for decades.
Right.
But it seems like they've been facing some setbacks lately.
That's right. The Muslim Brotherhood has experienced a number of setbacks in recent years, including crackdowns by governments and internal divisions within the movement itself. Some scholars argue that this signals a decline in their influence as a political force.
One of the articles pointed out something I found really interesting. The Gulf monarchies
Okay.
seem to view the Muslim Brotherhood's embrace of democracy as a threat. In fact, they've intervened in countries like Egypt and Sudan to undermine the Brotherhood's political gains. It seems counterintuitive. Wouldn't they want more democratic systems in the region?
Not necessarily. From their perspective, the Muslim Brotherhood's version of democracy might be seen as a pathway to Islamism, which could threaten their own power structures. It highlights the complex interplay between religious and political ambitions in the region.
So are we witnessing the decline of political Islam as a whole? Is there something else emerging to take its place?
Some scholars are using the term post-Islamism to describe this potential shift. It suggests that the appeal of Islamism, with its focus on establishing an Islamic state, has waned. This doesn't mean that people are abandoning their faith,
Right.
but they might be seeking new ways to express it, ways that are more compatible with modern life and globalized society.
That makes sense. It's like they're moving beyond this idea of imposing a specific religious vision on the state and exploring how to live as a Muslim in the 21st century. Speaking of navigating life's complexities, one of the sources you sent really stood out to me, the Common Wisdom document featuring the teachings of Luqmān the Wise.
Okay.
It's fascinating that he's revered by both Christians and Muslims. You don't see that kind of cross-cultural appeal very often, do you?
It is quite remarkable. Luqmān's wisdom, primarily presented as advice to his son, transcends religious boundaries. It touches on universal themes like humility, the transient nature of worldly life, and the importance of preparing for the afterlife.
His sayings are so direct and memorable, like, whoever sells the hereafter for the sake of this world will lose them both.
Yeah.
Talk about a reality check. Or how about this one? Do not put off repentance, for truly death comes suddenly. It really makes you think about your priorities, doesn't it?
It certainly does. But Luqmān's wisdom isn't just about these abstract spiritual concepts. He also emphasizes practical wisdom and ethical conduct. He often uses vivid analogies to drive his points home, like the example of ants diligently storing food for the winter,
Yeah.
which teaches us about foresight and responsibility.
I love that analogy. It reminds us that even the smallest creatures can offer valuable lessons. And speaking of wisdom figures who have offered valuable lessons, Luqmán's teachings about living a righteous life make me think of other figures who have championed peace and ethical conduct.
Yes. And that leads us perfectly into our next discussion about two prominent peace advocates,
Okay.
Mahatma Gandhi and Fethullah Gülen. Although they come from different religious backgrounds, their ideas about nonviolence and truth share a surprising degree of harmony.
That's what I found so fascinating. They seem to be approaching these concepts from completely different angles, yet they arrive at similar conclusions. It really highlights the universality of these principles.
It does. Gandhi's concept of ahimsa, which essentially means non-offense or non-violence, aligns quite closely with Gülen's idea of musbit hareket, which translates to positive action. Both emphasize the importance of consistent, positive actions that promote peace and reconciliation.
And they both seem to stress the importance of inner transformation as a prerequisite for outer peace.
Right.
It's like Gandhi famously said, ahimsa means that you may not offend anybody. You may not harbor uncharitable thought, even in connection with those you consider your enemies.
Yeah.
That's a pretty high bar, wouldn't you say?
It is a high bar, but it speaks to the depth of their commitment to nonviolence. It's not just about avoiding physical harm. It's about cultivating a mindset of compassion and understanding, even towards those who might oppose you.
What I find really compelling is how both Gandhi and Gülen connect this commitment to nonviolence with a deep reverence for truth. Gandhi's concept of satyagraha, which means truth force,
Okay.
seems to resonate with Gülen's emphasis on raza, which is about living in a way that pleases God.
That's a great observation. For Gülen, pleasing God involves acting with justice, mercy, and goodness. It's about aligning your actions with a higher purpose, a purpose that transcends individual desires and ambitions.
And this alignment with a higher purpose seems to be the heart of Gülen's Hizmet movement, which focuses on education, social enterprise, and interfaith dialogue. It's like they're putting these principles into action, creating tangible change in the world.
Exactly. The Hizmet movement embodies this idea of service to humanity as a form of worship. It's about channeling your faith into positive action that benefits not just yourself, but the wider community and the world as a whole.
And it's interesting how Gülen distinguishes between the internal and external dimensions of jihad. While the external jihad might involve defending oneself against oppression, he places primary importance on the internal struggle, the battle against our own negative emotions and desires.
It's a powerful reminder that true peace starts within. Before we can create a more peaceful world, we need to cultivate peace within ourselves, within our own hearts and minds.
That's such an important point. It makes me think about the Salam Institute and the work they're doing to promote peace education in places like Chad, Niger, Burkina Faso, and Cameroon.
Wow.
What struck me about their approach is their focus on Quranic schools. Those aren't exactly known for being hotbeds of peace studies. It seems like a pretty ambitious undertaking, wouldn't you say?
It is ambitious, but also incredibly important. The Salam Institute recognizes that if you want to create lasting peace, you need to start at the grassroots level, working within existing institutions and cultural frameworks.
One of the things that surprised me was they faced some initial resistance. It seems like some teachers were skeptical about these outsiders coming in and talking about peace. But the Salam Institute was persistent. They built trust by working directly with local elders and religious leaders, ensuring that their approach was authentic and aligned with local values. They even went so far as to create educational guides in local dialects, which I thought was really impressive.
It's a great example of how cultural sensitivity and genuine collaboration are essential for successful peace building. The Salam Institute's approach underscores the importance of understanding local contexts and working within those contexts to promote positive change.
What I found particularly fascinating was their emphasis on applying Islamic values to real-world challenges. They constantly prompt reflection with the question, what would Prophet Muhammad do? It's not just about memorizing scripture. It's about engaging with those teachings on a deeper level and finding ways to live them out in your daily life.
Exactly. It's about bridging the gap between theory and practice, between faith and action.
Okay, time to tackle a big one. The myth that Islam spread by the sword. This misconception is not only inaccurate, but also incredibly harmful. It's been used to justify violence and discrimination against Muslims for centuries. It's crucial that we debunk this myth and expose it for what it is, a dangerous distortion of history.
Absolutely. The Quran itself contains a powerful verse that directly contradicts this myth. It states that killing one person is equivalent to killing all of humanity,
Wow.
and saving one person is equivalent to saving all of humanity. This verse emphasizes the sanctity of human life and the profound interconnectedness of all people.
Wow, that's a powerful statement. It's a far cry from the image of a violent conquering religion that's often portrayed in popular culture.
Right. And if we look at the historical record, the early battles fought by the Prophet Muhammad were actually quite small in scale, with relatively few casualties compared to the massive conflicts we've seen in modern times.
That's a really good point. It puts things into perspective. So if Islam doesn't condone violence and conquest, what does it say about warfare?
While Islam does permit defensive warfare, it stresses that evil should be repelled with good, whenever possible. It also explicitly forbids forcing anyone to convert to Islam. The Quran clearly states, "There is no compulsion in religion. Indeed, right has become distinct from wrong." This verse underscores the importance of free will and respect for individual choice.
That's such a fundamental principle. It's a reminder that true faith cannot be coerced. It must be freely chosen. And speaking of challenging conventional thinking, let's shift gears and dive into the world of Islamic economics.
Ah, yes. Islamic economics is fascinating because it represents a radical rethinking of Western economic models. And it's not just about tweaking existing systems, it's about creating an entirely new framework based on Islamic principles.
And it seems like there's a real evolution happening within the field of Islamic economics. From what I've read, there have been 3 distinct generations of thought. The first generation focused on creating alternatives to existing economic models. The second generation tried to reconcile Islamic principles with Western economic theory, but the third generation is where things get really interesting.
The third generation is asking a more fundamental question. What would an economic system look like if it was built entirely on Islamic principles? It's a bold and ambitious undertaking.
And one of the things that struck me about this third generation is their emphasis on spiritual development over material consumption.
Oh,
They're basically saying that the purpose of life isn't just to accumulate wealth,
right.
but to grow closer to God and cultivate virtue. It's a pretty radical departure from the dominant economic paradigm, wouldn't you say?
It is. In this model, the economy isn't just a means to an end. It's seen as an integral part of a holistic way of life, a way of life that prioritizes spiritual growth and ethical conduct.
And they seem to reject this individualistic me mindset that's so prevalent in Western economics.
Yep.
Instead, they're emphasizing the importance of the family, the community, and humanity as a whole. It's a much more interconnected and interdependent view of the world.
Precisely. This third generation of Islamic economics recognizes that we're all part of a larger web of relationships, and that our actions have consequences that extend far beyond ourselves.
Another thing that caught my attention was their rejection of nafs, which basically refers to the ego, or the lower self. They argue against basing morality on pleasure or self-gratification, which is pretty countercultural in a society that's so driven by consumerism and instant gratification.
It's a profound challenge to the dominant ethos of our time. It's about recognizing that true happiness and fulfillment come not from chasing fleeting pleasures, but from aligning ourselves with a higher purpose.
It's like they're saying, let's transform ourselves from the inside out, and let's create an economic system that reflects those values. It's a pretty bold vision, wouldn't you say?
It is. And it's a vision that's gaining traction among a growing number of scholars and activists who are seeking to create a more just, equitable, and sustainable world.
Well, that's a great place to pause for now. We've covered a lot of ground, from the shifting landscape of political Islam to the timeless wisdom of Luqmān, from the principles of nonviolence espoused by Gandhi and Gülen to the practical peace-building efforts of the Salam Institute. And we've even delved into the fascinating world of Islamic economics and its challenge to conventional economic thinking. I don't know about you, but my brain is feeling a little full.
Mine too. It's been a whirlwind tour. Like some incredibly complex and fascinating topics. But as you said, it's a good place to pause and let these ideas sink in. We've only just scratched the surface, and there's so much more to explore.
Exactly. We'll pick up where we left off in part 2, where we'll be taking a deep dive into a pivotal moment in history, the French Revolution. We'll explore the clash between the entrenched religio-political ideology of medieval Christianity and the burgeoning Enlightenment movement. And we'll see how this clash of worldviews set the stage for a radical transformation of society.
It's a story of upheaval, innovation, and the enduring struggle for freedom and justice. So stay tuned for part 2, where we'll delve into this fascinating chapter of history and connect it back to our broader themes of Islam, politics, and peace. Host speaker.
Welcome back to our deep dive into Islam, politics, and peace. In the last part, we explored the dynamic landscape of political Islam, the timeless wisdom of Luqmān the Wise, and the inspiring work of peace advocates like Gandhi and Gülen. We even touched on the thought-provoking ideas behind Islamic economics. Now get ready for a journey back in time as we explore a pivotal moment in history, the French Revolution.
That's right. The French Revolution wasn't just about France. It was a seismic event that had repercussions throughout the world. To truly understand its impact, we need to delve into the system it sought to overthrow medieval Christianity and its grip on French society.
It's fascinating how deeply religion and politics were intertwined in medieval Europe. It seems like almost every aspect of life was shaped by the church's doctrines and authority.
Absolutely. Medieval France was deeply rooted in Trinitarian theology, which emphasized a hierarchical structure mirroring the Holy Trinity, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Just as the Trinity was seen as the foundation of the divine order, French society was divided into three estates: the clergy, the nobility, and the commoners.
And the king was right at the top of this pyramid, wasn't he? He was considered a divine figure, God's representative on earth.
Exactly. The king was seen as both a political and spiritual leader responsible for upholding the Catholic faith and maintaining social order. This gave him immense power and authority.
But one of the articles you sent mentioned that the church wasn't just a spiritual force, it was also a major economic player. Apparently they owned a huge amount of land and were exempt from paying taxes. That seems like a recipe for resentment, wouldn't you say?
It certainly created a lot of tension. The church's vast wealth and privileges stood in stark contrast to the poverty and hardship faced by the majority of the population, particularly the peasantry, who were burdened with heavy taxes and exploitative feudal contracts.
So you have this rigid social hierarchy, economic inequality, and a powerful church that seems more concerned with its own wealth and influence than with the well-being of the people. It's no wonder the seeds of revolution were sown.
And then you have the Enlightenment, this intellectual and cultural movement that swept across Europe, challenging traditional authority and emphasizing reason, individual liberty, and scientific inquiry.
It's like the Enlightenment was a crack in the foundation of the old order.
Yeah.
Suddenly, people were questioning everything they'd been told to believe, including the church's authority and the legitimacy of the monarchy.
Exactly. The Enlightenment encouraged critical thinking and challenged people to use reason to understand the world around them. This led to a growing awareness of the injustices and inequalities of the existing system.
One thing I found really interesting was that while the French Enlightenment drew inspiration from earlier reform movements like the Socinian and Unitarian reforms that challenged traditional Christian doctrines, it seems like it took things much further, much faster.
That's right. The French case was particularly volatile because the church and monarchy were so deeply entrenched, holding immense power and resisting any attempts at reform. It was like a pressure cooker waiting to explode.
So what were some of the key factors that finally triggered this explosion, this eruption of social and political upheaval?
Well, the French economy was in a dire state, partly due to the monarchy's excessive spending on wars and lavish lifestyles.
They were basically bankrupting the country to maintain their extravagant courts and fund their military adventures. It reminds me of what we talked about earlier with some Middle Eastern countries relying too heavily on oil wealth. It's like they haven't learned from history.
It's a cautionary tale for sure. And in France, this economic crisis was compounded by a series of bad harvests, which led to skyrocketing food prices. Remember, bread was the staple food for most people. When the price of bread goes up, people get desperate.
Desperate enough to storm the Bastille, as they say.
Precisely, the storming of the Bastille in 1789 is often seen as the symbolic start of the French Revolution. It was a powerful message that the people were no longer willing to tolerate oppression and were ready to take matters into their own hands.
And it wasn't just a symbolic act. They literally tore down the Bastille brick by brick. It seems like they were channeling their rage and frustration into something tangible, something they could actually see and feel.
It was a dramatic demonstration of their determination to break free from the old order, and once the revolution began, it gained momentum quickly. The National Assembly was formed, and they started drafting a new constitution that would strip the king of his absolute power.
Then what about the church? They were sitting on a mountain of wealth and privilege. How did they fare during this upheaval?
The revolutionaries saw the church as part of the problem, as an institution that was corrupt, oppressive, and out of touch with the needs of the people. They confiscated church lands, abolished tithes, and dissolved monasteries. It was a radical restructuring of French society.
Wow, talk about a hostile takeover. It seems like they were determined to dismantle the church's power and influence completely.
It was a dramatic shift. But it's important to remember that this wasn't just about economics. It was also about ideas. The revolutionaries were embracing the ideals of the Enlightenment, reason, liberty, equality, and fraternity. They wanted to create a society where everyone had equal rights and opportunities, a society based on reason and justice, not superstition and privilege.
So it wasn't necessarily about eliminating religion altogether, but rather transforming it, making it more compatible with these new values.
That's right. While there was certainly anti-religious sentiment, especially directed at the Catholic Church, it wouldn't be accurate to say they were trying to eliminate religion entirely. Many revolutionaries still considered themselves Christians, but they wanted a different kind of Christianity, one that was more in line with the values of the Enlightenment, reason, individual conscience, and freedom of belief.
So less about blind faith and more about ethics and a personal relationship with God.
Exactly. They even tried to create a new secularized version of Christianity with the cult of reason, which emphasized reason and virtue over traditional religious doctrines.
Wow. They tried to reinvent religion. It seems like they were really committed to creating a new system based on their own values.
They even created a new calendar that replaced traditional Christian holidays with secular celebrations of reason, virtue, and labor. It was a radical experiment in social engineering.
But with all this upheaval and rejection of the old order, did the revolution actually achieve its goals? Did it succeed in creating a more just and equitable society?
The French Revolution was a long and complex process, full of twists and turns, violence, and political intrigue. It wasn't a clean break from the past. There were periods of terror, counter-revolutions, and ultimately Napoleon's rise to power.
So not exactly a fairy tale ending.
No. But despite its flaws and complexities, the French Revolution had a profound impact on France and the world. It toppled the monarchy, challenged the power of the church, and inspired revolutionary movements across the globe.
It's like they planted the seeds for democracy and human rights, even if they didn't fully realize those ideals in their own time.
Absolutely. The ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity that were at the heart of the revolution continue to resonate today. The French Revolution reminds us that even the most entrenched systems of power can be challenged, and that the pursuit of a more just and equitable world is an ongoing struggle.
What a fascinating and tumultuous journey. We've traveled from the rise and fall of political Islam to the wisdom of Luqmān, the peace activism of Gandhi and Gülen, the challenges of Islamic peace education, the sanctity of life in Islam, and the radical rethinking of economics from an Islamic perspective. And now we've explored the French Revolution and its roots in the clash between the Enlightenment and medieval Christianity.
It's been quite a ride, and in part 3 we'll shift our focus back to the present day, exploring the concept of post-Islamism and considering what the future might hold for Islam and the Middle East. Stay tuned.
Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive into Islam politics and peace. I feel like we've time-traveled through centuries of history and ideas, from exploring the shifting tides of political Islam to unpacking the wisdom of Luqmān the Wise, from the peaceful activism of Gandhi and Gülen to the on-the-ground work of the Salam Institute, and of course, who could forget our journey through the tumultuous French Revolution?
It's been a whirlwind tour through some incredibly complex and fascinating topics. But as we shift our focus back to the present day, I'm curious to hear your thoughts after everything we've discussed. What stands out to you the most?
Honestly, the sheer diversity within Islamic thought is what strikes me. We've seen interpretations ranging from the strict rigidity of Wahhabism to the socially engaged activism of the Muslim Brotherhood, from the focus on inner transformation in Gülen's teachings to the innovative approaches of the Salam Institute. It's clear that there's no one-size-fits-all understanding of Islam, and that's something the media often misses.
I completely agree. It's crucial to recognize this diversity, especially as we consider the future Islam in the Middle East. One concept we've touched on is post-Islamism. It suggests that the appeal of Islamism, with its emphasis on establishing an Islamic state, might be waning. What are your thoughts on this idea?
It's definitely thought-provoking. If political Islam is indeed declining, what might fill that void? What new ideologies or movements might emerge?
That's a question scholars are grappling with right now. It's not necessarily about people abandoning their faith, but rather seeking new ways to express it, ways that are more compatible with modern life and globalized society. It's like what we saw with the Salam Institute. They're working within the existing religious framework to promote peace and address contemporary challenges.
That resonates with what we discussed about Saudi Arabia seemingly shifting away from Wahhabism and focusing on a more nationalistic identity. And remember those articles about Middle Eastern countries investing heavily in technology, economic diversification, and fostering creative spaces. It seems like they're looking for a different path forward, one that moves beyond the old paradigms of political Islam.
It's fascinating to witness this evolution in real time. There's a sense that many of the countries are realizing that oil wealth won't last forever, and they're trying to build more sustainable and resilient societies. It makes me wonder what kind of role Islam will play in this process.
Right. Will it be a force for progress and innovation, or will it be seen as an obstacle to modernization? And what about the potential for greater democratic freedoms? If the state is less focused on imposing a particular religious ideology, could that create more space for political participation and dissent?
It's certainly a possibility, but it's not a guaranteed outcome. The decline of Islamism doesn't automatically translate into greater democracy. Authoritarian regimes can find other ways to maintain control, and there's always the risk of new forms of repression emerging.
That's a sobering thought. And it makes me think about what happens to groups like the Muslim Brotherhood or even more extreme organizations if they lose their grip on power. Will they peacefully integrate into a new political landscape, or will they resort to violence and extremism?
That's a critical question, and it highlights the complexity of the situation. The Middle East is a region with deep-seated sectarian tensions, ongoing conflicts, and the lingering effects of colonialism and foreign intervention. These factors can't be ignored as we try to understand the trajectory of the region.
It seems like predicting the future is a fool's errand, especially in such a volatile and dynamic part of the world. But what I've taken away from this deep dive is the importance of nuanced analysis and avoiding simplistic narratives.
Absolutely. The future of the Middle East is not predetermined. It's going to be shaped by the choices that individuals, groups, and states make in the years to come. And those choices will be influenced by a complex interplay of factors: religious beliefs, political ambitions, economic realities, social dynamics, and global events.
So what does this all mean for you as you continue to learn and engage with this topic?
It reinforces the importance of critical thinking, staying informed, and remaining open to different perspectives. It also reminded me that the quest for understanding is a lifelong journey, and there's always more to learn.
That's a perfect note to end on. I hope this deep dive has given our listeners a more nuanced and informed understanding of Islam, its intersection with politics, and the pursuit of peace. We've explored some fascinating and complex ideas, but this is really just the starting point. There's a whole world of knowledge out there waiting to be discovered.
And remember, the most important takeaway is to keep asking questions, keep exploring, and never stop learning.
Until next time, happy diving.